All right. G'day, g'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis, the podcast where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name is Pietro. I don't have either of my wingmen today, Max or Floyd, but I do have a wingwoman. So we've got Carri Cee with us today, who is the resident Libertarian Party's expert on Bitcoin and also the host of a podcast called Bitcoin People. And the fact that she's libertarian and interested in Bitcoin is especially important because she might be able to give us less savvy blockchain libertarians some insights as to why there are so many libertarians and people broadly who are so interested in this idea of cryptocurrencies as a way of expounding freedom in the world that we live in. So very excited to have her on. Welcome to the show, Carri. How are you?
I am so happy to be here. I'm really well. The sun is out, spring is here, and I just want to make one tiny correction, which is the issue of being an expert. I don't know that I would go that far. I'm an enthusiast of both Bitcoin and libertarianism, and I would say the third leg on the stool is Austrian economics. So I'm an enthusiast and an interested party and all of the above, but I don't want to put myself on the platform of expert. Way too many people been around this space way longer than me, way more expert.
Well, I am comparatively very far from an expert, so maybe an expert compared to me, but not towards some other people. Let's put it that way. How does that sound?
It's all relative. That's fair enough. As long as someone knows just a little bit more than you, as they seem like the expert.
That's right. I mean, I'm a teacher by trade, and I'm usually no more than one or two lessons ahead of the students. So, and they certainly think I'm an expert, and I pretend to be an expert. It is all
And you're
relative.
older and hairier.
Yes, very important. Very important. It's amazing how much more respect they show you when you have a beard compared to when you don't. That's a quick tip for anyone looking to get into the profession. It's actually true.
That's what I'm doing wrong. I'll work on it.
Cool. So the I am, and I hopefully this maybe some of our viewers and listeners are much more expert than I am, but I have a very limited working knowledge of Bitcoin. I know broadly what it is. I know that it's this. I know the term cryptocurrency. It's a way of using. It's a type of money. That's kind of what I know. So I was hoping that you could give me maybe a broad insight first on what Bitcoin is, and then maybe we can talk about how it relates to the rest of the libertarian world.
Okay, big question, and I could just go from here. And I could easily eat up a lot of the rest of the time just
Let's go
answering
broad
that
strokes then for the most
broad
basic
strokes, and then we can
understanding.
dig down.
Yeah.
So here's where I would start. First of all, absolutely, I wish the very first lesson anyone had given me was there is Bitcoin and there is everything else in the cryptocurrency market. There's the other 20 or 30,000 cryptocurrency projects. None of them are like Bitcoin. So first and foremost, let's not conflate those two terms. And if listeners walk away with only one takeaway out of this whole discussion, it would be there's Bitcoin and there's the rest of cryptocurrency. Technically, Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency and the first and the biggest. And in many ways, you can think of it as the same way that email was the first killer app built on top of the internet. Yeah. So if you've got like this foundational layer and then email built on top of it. So, and this is where it gets a bit confusing with Bitcoin, but just go with me slowly here. There's Bitcoin, the blockchain, that's capital B Bitcoin. And that's like the internet. And that's a big kind of network of nodes all over the planet, tens of thousands of nodes, all maintaining the blockchain, which is fundamentally a ledger of every transaction that has ever taken place in Bitcoin. And then on top of that, you've got your first killer app, dare I say, just to make matters difficult, which is Bitcoin with a lowercase b, and that's the currency Bitcoin, which is the one that everybody's aware of, that seems to go up and down in price versus the US dollar, and that people get interested in during bull markets because price go up, and then people assume it's a scam and it's a tulip, mania and a bubble and all of this stuff during a bear market. And that's Bitcoin with a lowercase v on top of the blockchain. That's the currency that's built on the blockchain. So that's first and foremost. If we go into
So sorry, while we're still on that, so what is it about Bitcoin? Is it the fact that it's first that makes it so different to the rest of the cryptocurrencies? Is that the main difference? Like, why is that on such a higher pedestal?
Right, good. Yes, it's the first, and so that's part of it. But, and I'll tie that back in because there is part of it in terms of what's called I think it's the Lindy effect. Oh no, the Lindy effect is when it's longer that it's around, the more secure it becomes. There's simply the network effect with Bitcoin that means that even if you built a new currency that was exactly the same as Bitcoin today, built on the same processes and principles and technology and cryptography, Bitcoin would have such a huge advantage over that new cryptocurrency because of the 14 years of history and because of the huge network effect of adopters. There's 200 million wallet holders in the world now because of the network of nodes verifying every transaction, tens of thousands of those node operators. You've already got for Bitcoin, in terms of that first mover advantage, as it were, you've already got not only miners, but publicly listed miners. There's at least half a dozen publicly listed Bitcoin miners on the New York Stock Exchange being traded actively daily, who have these warehouses that are just these crazy massive warehouses that they set up all over, like generally next to a really cheap renewable energy supply, but often also using stranded energy from things like gas. So they can use, the burn off you see with gas, the waste that can be used instead. That stranded energy that's just getting burnt off can be used instead. We're going right down a rabbit hole here that I didn't mean to get into, that can be used for mining Bitcoin. So it's using a lot of renewable, and I'm saying this really because I just want to dispel this myth right up front that it's bad for the environment, because it's dare I say, one of the ultimate gaslighting, excuse pun, kind of arguments thrown at Bitcoin. So there is a big first mover advantage in all of that. Having said that, that's probably not primarily what makes it different from the other 20 to 30,000 cryptocurrencies, because very few of them have tried to actually copy Bitcoin outright, and there would be no point in doing so. They are often playing with technologies that use very different processes, very different cryptography. So let me just go through and differentiate that in a number of different ways. So one of the primary differentiators of Bitcoin is that it is what's called proof. They use a proof of stake. Sorry, try again. Proof of work, as opposed to, they use something called proof of work to create a block on the blockchain that records the Bitcoin transactions. That is unlike 95 to 99% of other cryptocurrencies. Why is that important? Proof of work means a number of things, and it ties in with another piece that's very different about Bitcoin. So I'm just going to throw these in the same basket. Perhaps somebody else wouldn't do it this way, and maybe this attests to my lack of expertise on the technology side of this. So Bitcoin is hugely decentralized. There is no company, there is no C-suite, there is no executive, there is no marketing arm, there is no business. It is a protocol like the internet. The internet is not a business. There are big businesses built on top of it, like Google and Facebook, as we know, and Amazon and so forth. But the internet, in and of itself, was created by, as we understand it, the Defense Forces, to be decentralized such that there would be no one, what do they call it, point of weakness, like a single point of weakness or weak link in the chain. It is decentralized, and therefore nobody can bomb the Pentagon and take out the internet. Yeah. So Bitcoin is exactly the same in that regard. And funnily enough, it actually uses cryptography that was also used within the Defense Forces and created, invented, if you like, within the Defense Forces. So it's massively decentralized, and there's no, point of weakness. If China bans mining, no biggie, within a month or 2 months, all the miners have moved to Eastern Europe and just set up their racks of computers over there, and off we go. And we saw hash power, or the generation of blocks, reduce somewhat during that time, and then immediately bounce back up in a kind of V shape. So it's massively decentralized, which makes it very secure. And then there's this other piece called proof of work, which means this decentralized network of miners and nodes. But let's just focus on the miners for a moment, because they're the ones using proof of work. They have to mine a block, to create a block on the blockchain, and to what they're looking to do, they're all competing against each other, and they're going, I want to mine the block because I will get rewards in Bitcoin, the currency, if I win the lottery of mining this block of transactions, which means being allowed the right to bring in all the transactions of the last 10 minutes and stick them on my block, record them as part of the blockchain for time immemorial, right? That's a permanent record of every transaction. I want that block because I'm going to get the rewards. So what I'm going to do is I've got to guess a number, and it's a number below 0, and so it gets smaller and smaller, the number, and the more, we could get into a whole lot of complexity here, but about something called the difficulty adjustment. But basically, I've got to run all of my computers as fast as possible to try and win and guess that number before all the other miners on the planet, right? And if I get to that number first, I have shown that I have proven that I've done the work. I've used the computing power and the electricity, or the energy. It's my computers that have done that work. I win the block. I get the rewards. So you can't, this is the thing about Bitcoin. And again, this makes it very different from 99% of other cryptocurrencies, and where it also starts to differentiate itself from all other currencies. Fiat currency, gold, silver, anything we've ever used as currency, polished shells, cows, grain, whatever was salt, whatever we've used in the past as currencies. The thing that Bitcoin does differently from all other cryptocurrencies and all other currencies is it has, as part of that protocol that that keeps itself ticking over, that was released on the 3rd of January 2009, and is still just ticking itself over to this day, with a bunch of miners and a bunch of nodes just volunteering their time and money and their energy and their hardware, and they're all putting in together to keep that protocol going. That protocol cannot be changed in any way except with 51% approval of all of those miners and all of those nodes all over the world. You've got to get agreement. So that's a very big chore to get 51%. And so, because, you know, it's like any community, particularly a smart community full of geeks and geeks who are on top of one of the most leading edge technologies in the world, you're not going to get them to agree easily on any change in the protocol. There have been some. There's such things as hard forks and soft forks. So there's been times where there's been a hard fork, most notably when there was a big argument over the size of the blocks. That was a big deal. It was kind of a big fallout in the community from 2015 to 2017. And some people went their own way with larger size blocks, but the majority of the community stuck with the original protocol. And that's Bitcoin as we know it today, with the original size blocks. So there are hard forks, and there's very occasionally soft forks, which are much more minor adjustments to the protocol. But the biggest piece that I can't begin to, because it's the piece that people believe so strongly in, I can't imagine in a million years, 51% of the community agreeing to a change in this piece. It is that there is a 21 million hard cap supply of Bitcoin ever. There will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin created or generated. So what that means is for each block that's created, a certain number of Bitcoin is allocated. So, and that's halved every 4 years. So to begin with, it was 50 Bitcoin that were minted at a time for each block that was generated. Then it became 25, and then 4 years later it became 12 and a half, and now it's 6.25. And with the next halving next year, it'll become 3.125. So the rewards are halved. So the majority of the Bitcoin is already out there in 18 years. So, in 14 years, there's about 18.5 million Bitcoin out of the 21 million already in existence. And so there's this hard cap at 21 million. Now, what's so exciting and what's so different about that? So we're saying it's going to be very, 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 very difficult to change that, for that to ever change. There's no central authority who can change that. You need 51% of these people all over the world to change that. So that's why it's so exciting. Nothing like that has existed before. We've always had currencies that we've had to make do, that we have gone, this is the best of a bad lot out there. You know, at one stage it was cattle, at one stage it was grain. But what's the problem with grain? Well, we can just grow more. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, now everybody's growing grain and it's not valuable to anybody. We can't use sand because, you know, I give you a handful of sand, I can go get my own handful of sand. That's not valuable to me. So scarcity became obvious over many thousands of years as being a relevant part of the story that makes a currency valuable to everybody. And that's why gold came out on top of even silver or copper, because even though the utility isn't as great as silver or copper, it's scarcer. Less comes out of the ground every year than copper or silver. Cryptocurrencies, the other 20 or 30,000, 99% of them have a central authority. They are a business and they can be mined more of or created more of at the drop of a hat, the same way that a business can create extra shares in its business and dilute the value of all the shares across the board. And you could say the other 1% of cryptocurrencies that are proof of work and that operate in a similar way to Bitcoin have the disadvantage. That's where Bitcoin's first mover advantage comes into play, and that network effect. That's where the advantage comes into play over any other cryptocurrencies that do actually replicate Bitcoin in that sense. So you've got this. Sorry, I'm going on. I do this.
No, it's good. It's perfect. And like, I think that overview already, like the I knew the importance of the finite bit, and that's kind of what I want to dig into a little bit now. But the whole thing about the blockchains, I knew that there was mining, and I knew that there was some process by which people were trying to attain these bitcoins. But even that, the fact that you are essentially proving that you have the capabilities or the right to the responsibility of having this block, that's all new to me, and hopefully also a lot of our listeners. What I kind of wanted to dig in a little bit further here is now let's look at like the libertarian aspect to it all. So a libertarian insight is, as you were saying, is that what the government or the state does with our money is something very dishonest. So the idea of fiat currency, as you mentioned before, is currency that is not backed by anything hard. It's not backed by gold. It's not backed by anything. It's essentially backed by the governments or the states claiming that this thing has value. And the problem with that also is the fact that the government, through the Reserve Bank or through central banks all over the world, reserve the right to print more of this money and use it for their nefarious and never-ending list of causes and pockets that they need to grease in order to consolidate their power. And the value of this new money that is created, as you said, comes from all of the existing money that is already in circulation. Because if your $40,000 that you have in the bank was $40,000 at this one point in time, and you've taken a number of years to save up this $40,000, every time the government prints new money, that $40,000 has less purchasing power. And that's what we're seeing today with inflation and people having the cost of living going up enormously is due to this completely irresponsible government spending that has happened, especially over the last few years. And Bitcoin, and I think this is kind of where the libertarian insight comes in, Bitcoin offers something of a solution to this. So if you could talk to that a little, that's kind of I think the bit that libertarians, because there is a lot of a cross section between the Bitcoin community and libertarians, and I dare say my guess is that this is where it comes in. This is why there is such excitement around the technology.
Spot on, and I'm really pleased you pulled me up from my rant and got me back on track and brought it back to the libertarian conversation. Thank you. So you're absolutely right in what you're saying there. Spot on. So, and to me, it makes no sense to me how a Bitcoiner cannot be a libertarian, and equally how a libertarian, once they understand what Bitcoin's actually all about, can't become a Bitcoiner, in fact. So, I want to just take... There's two aspects to this. There's number one, what you've just said, which is the 21 million hard cap, and the fact that it is a more responsible, therefore, currency than a currency that can be printed, that can create inflation, which is like an additional tax. Like we haven't got enough taxes already. Inflation becomes a sneaky additional tax. And that can be fleshed out in a number of ways. And then, so I want to talk about the hard cap for a moment, but I also want to talk about Bitcoin being a peer-to-peer currency that cuts out the middleman of any government or any bank or any payment app like a credit card or a PayPal or something along those lines. So these are two ways in which it absolutely supports directly our libertarian values. So the piece about the 21 million hard cap is exactly as you've just said. It can't be printed, and therefore, so inflation is deeply evil, because a government, first of all, it used to be backed by gold, as we know. Then they would do fractional reserve banking, which means they would issue more certificates for the gold, redeemable for gold, than there was actual gold in the bank. Then eventually the US was just about to default on their debt because England and France were coming over to collect their gold from the Federal Reserve, where in the US where it had been kept. And because the US couldn't pay the gold because they didn't have the gold there, they just declared there is no more gold standard and our US dollars are it. And they were already the reserve currency of the world for trading purposes. And so we know as libertarians, there's over 100 different taxes on us as Australians. Everything from our income tax, obviously, and capital gains tax, and GST, and council rates, and pet registrations, and we can get down to fines, and we can get down to the land taxes, and then the fringe benefit taxes, and you name it. There's a million taxes, and they're all, and then whatever you might be left. So that's been estimated by the Australian Tax Association for even those in the lowest and middle kind of incomes to be in the vicinity of 50%, and then higher than that for people making a bigger income. So that's pretty outrageous. Then what's left over? They're printing this money to pay their debts and to give handouts so that they can look like good guys and get elected back in under the guise of this being some sort of democracy, except both parties do this equally. They both print money. And so what that means,
and not just here, everywhere in the world. It's
everywhere
not an
in
Australian
the world.
problem. Yeah.
No, by no means an Australian only problem. You're absolutely right. And you could argue Australia has to do that, and interest rates to be competitive and all of this stuff. So, but what that means is, and please excuse me if I'm teaching anyone to suck eggs here. I don't mean, maybe everyone's kind of familiar with this concept. But so now, with what little we've got left over after paying our feudal overlords their taxes, they now print money, which of course devalues the purchasing power of the dollars you have left in the bank, which is the same as saying inflation. You can buy less with the same amount of money you had before. The purchasing power is gone. So it might look like prices going up, but that is simply a reflection of the purchasing power actually coming down because of the devaluation by the flood of new money coming into the market. And just
and of course, and just as an aside, they're always extremely dishonest about why this cost of living has gone up, why this purchasing power is down. It's always excused on various different things like corporate greed, or if there's
price gouging,
or now the popular one is that Putin's war with Ukraine is causing all these prices to go up. Yes, and in reality, it's actually the monetary policy of all the states around the world causing their own dollar to go down in value. But they'll never admit that that's the cause, because obviously that is extremely unpopular.
Absolutely. And what happens then, of course, is they say that they fiddle the numbers on the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, so they keep changing the basket of goods on which they measure the CPI. So it makes it makes it look like the cost of living isn't as bad as we all know it is, right? We go to the supermarket, we know in reality what it is. So, and the reason they keep that down is because things like pensions are linked to the CPI. So you can't have pensions actually keeping pace with the cost of living because the government can't afford that. So it's a cheek, and then you've got things like, well, now you get a wage rise to keep up with the cost of living. But first of all, the wage rise is nowhere near as great as the rate of inflation. And now you're in a higher tax bracket. And then you also add into the equation that the way that the money printing works is actually through some trickery with treasury bonds and how they're sold into the financial market sector. They rehypothecate those, they lend those out, and so forth. So the money starts, so this is called the Cantillon effect, and it was identified by a guy called Richard Cantillon. And what it means is that the money disseminates or disperses through the highest echelons first, the financial markets and the political classes, and they get to spend it on assets. So you get asset inflation first that outstrips the pace of consumer inflation. So they're not fussed by consumer inflation because their properties and their yachts and their fine art and their this and their that is keeping pace, and shares are looking good because all the money is sloshing around now in the share market and creating a bubble in the share market. And so they're happy as Larry. And then, of course, it filters down. So it's also dishonest from that point of view. And then what you've also got is, there was just a thought. And so now, sorry, just to add to the problem with inflation, is that's affecting asset prices, which is taking houses out of reach for the working class and the middle class. But over and above that, now the price of the house has gone up. And even for those people who could afford the house, now CGT goes up for the investment properties, goes up too. So all of that, everything always works to siphon more money into the pockets of government, more money into the pockets of government. And then what do they do with that? They bloat their own ranks. And you end up with bigger and bigger government who have to justify their existence. I think I'm literally quoting your pamphlet now. And they have to, and then they get involved in more and more aspects of their life. And now suddenly we can't live without them doing our health, providing free health that we have just paid through our nose for. I mean, if we've got taxes of minimum of 50% when you add them all together, and then you've got inflation taking another, let's say 10% in reality, and so you've got all of this going on. If that's 60% minimum, that is 60% of our working lives. That is the number of months in a year. So that's through till July or August that we are simply paying our government dues. And then we're allowed 4 months left over to, what did I just say? No, hang on. Yeah, 7 or 8 months versus sort of 4 to 5 months that we're allowed to pay for our own needs, our food, our housing, our, God forbid, a holiday, anything, savings. And then, of course, not only is the price of goods and services going up, but the price of retirement. So the possibility of ever retiring is forever out of reach. It's a goalpost that can never be reached as long as they continue to print the money. And this is where, and I'm just going to bring in the second aspect now of Bitcoin, which is that it, not only can it not be printed, but now it's also peer-to-peer. I can send you Bitcoin and you're a long way away from me. If I wanted to get $20 to you, I would have to drive an hour and a half to get to you, yeah? And hand you $20. Or I can go via PayPal, which means I've got to trust PayPal and I've got to pay their fees. Or I can do it EFT. So I have to trust the bank not to freeze that transaction, because we know that if you disagree with them strongly enough, like the Canadian truck drivers,
Yep.
they can freeze your accounts, and anyone who donates to you, they can freeze your account and stop you from spending your money the way that you would like to spend your money, which is an expression of your values. I spend money on things that I value. So it's stopping me being a free individual and expressing my truth the way that I see fit. And so the bank, the payment apps, the PayPals, the credit cards, the whoever it is, we have to trust them to we're asking permission. And the thing about Bitcoin is it's permissionless. And I can send it direct to you and nobody can get in the way, and nobody can freeze that account, because the protocol is just ticking over and the miners process the blocks and our transaction goes through on the block, done, dusted. And in fact, over and above that, there's now, the same way that we had the internet and email, we've now got a further, we've got apps on top of that now. So we've got the protocol of Bitcoin, we've got the currency of Bitcoin, and now there's what's called second layer, which is known as the Lightning Network, is one of the second layer technologies, which means I can do it super fast. We don't have to wait for 10 minutes or maybe the next block 20 minutes for our transaction to go through by using this Lightning Network. I get it to you immediately. You've got it within 3 seconds. It's literally like getting out my wallet and handing $20 over to you. And no one can freeze it, and no government or bank or other third party can interfere with that transaction. And so now it's free markets. That is literally the definition of free markets, is people being able to produce the goods and services that are in demand, and us being able to pay for without, see, once we've got a CBDC in play, the government can go, we don't want you spending with this non-woke company. They don't exist anymore. We freeze any money going to them. They don't agree with us. You have to spend with, I mean, you are absolutely creating socialism.
Yeah, I do want to ask you about central bank digital currencies in a moment, but let me stick to a point just there based on what you've just said. So, the libertarian. So let's scale it back to the libertarian or the average person who is feeling the hit of all the things that you've just mentioned: the inflation, the taxation, all the rest of it. The value of their currency is going down, and they work till what did we say, July, August, purely to pay their overlords, which, of course, as we democratically elect, means that we want them there. The average person looks at, if they are cognizant of this whole situation, looks at all of this and thinks, okay, how do I protect the value of my money? And also, how can I spend it and in a way that suits me? So Bitcoin, from what you're saying, sounds like it's this really freeing opportunity to be able to trade and to be able to send money and purchase things without oversight by someone who tries to moralize your actions. But something that most people, I would say, while that is maybe something to strive for, are also concerned with protecting the value of their money. Now, I love the idea of gold. I'm certainly I'm much more comfortable with it simply because I understand it much better. And gold, you can understand as a store of value, is very fixed. So, you know, the value of the gold will always be worth that amount of gold. And if the value of money goes down, then the value of gold will remain the value of that gold. Bitcoin, this is something which I would say is maybe a criticism of Bitcoin, is because it is so prone to fads, prone to, you know, this bearish, bullish market, and people getting really excited about it because they see it in the news, and everyone goes and buys Bitcoin because you hear of one of your friends getting really rich over it. Is certainly not as stable, and so can it function as a store of value the way that obviously we know fiat currency can't, but most people, I think, are a little bit wary of using Bitcoin as a store of value. What would you say to that?
Good call. Great question. So again, a number of parts to that answer. Let's talk about volatility versus risk. So we have short-term volatility in the price of Bitcoin against the US dollar or the Australian dollar or any other currency. So did Amazon when it first listed. Very different asset because it's a share, but it was equally volatile. And actually, if you even compare charts, Amazon is almost equally volatile with Bitcoin today, even though it's 10 times the market capitalization, meaning size, and even though it's been around for at least 10 years longer than Bitcoin. Yeah. Gold has the advantage of being 5,000 years old. And you say it's a store of value, but that actually hasn't proven to be true over the last 10 years. I mean, it's back to where it was, but over the last 10 years, you saw a significant dip in the value of gold against the US dollar. You said an ounce of gold is worth an ounce of gold, but actually, if we're comparing it to the US dollar, which is what we're doing with Bitcoin here, yeah, if we're comparing apples with apples, then it actually hasn't been quite as stable as you might have imagined. And it's been down, I don't know where its low point was in Aussie dollars. It's back up to about $3,000 an ounce now, but it's been down to less than 2,500. So it certainly fluctuates over the longer term in smaller amounts. So I absolutely understand the volatility concern, and you have to think about Bitcoin in terms of its store of value proposition. So there's two parts to this. There's the freedom technology and there's the savings technology. The freedom technology is we can transact, as we've just talked about, peer-to-peer. The savings technology takes a little bit longer to wrap your head around, because this is where we go deep down the Austrian economics rabbit hole and this whole idea of the capped money supply. But basically, even the gold markets can be highly manipulated. You could argue that the gold price is nowhere near realistic, because we know that China and Russia and India hoard gold, and yet the price of gold does not reflect that. And we know they've been hoarding for the last 10 years, and at least, and that is not reflected in the price of gold. And the reason for that is that we never know the nature of the reserves in the Federal Reserve, the Chinese Reserve, the Russian Reserve, etc. And we don't know how much they can rehypothecate against that. So meaning creating kind of credit and paper markets. And then you add in the futures markets and the basically paper gold that sloshes around. So I had an account with Perth Mint, and you can get physical gold, which costs you a fortune in Perth Mint to store and to insure. Or you go with the paper, the, what do they call it? I've lost the word of it, the word for it, but basically it's certificate program, whereby the physical gold is not held against your certificate. The certificate is, as of old, redeemable for gold, but it costs you a fortune to redeem it. And I've been through this process recently. And then, and then what are you going to do with your gold? This is the thing. And this is why people speak of Bitcoin as being digital gold. Gold was superb for the 19th and 20th century because it created a hard store of value, and it was the best that we had. But it's got some really practical downsides. If I want to move that gold from Perth to Melbourne, as I did recently because I wanted to get away from those storage fees and those insurance fees over at Perth Mint, then the cost of that and the difficulty of that it's very, very impractical. So it's not, and if I'm doing international trade with Russia, what am I going to do? Start sending the gold over to them, and then I buy something from them and they've got to send it back to me? There's nothing that's really practical about it. And it's also not transparent, as we were just talking about with the reserve banks and so forth. So with Bitcoin, yes, it's short-term volatile, but you've got to think, if you're talking about a store of value, then you're thinking long-term. You are talking minimum 10 years. You are thinking minimum 20 years. You are thinking intergenerationally. This is for your children and your grandchildren, and thinking about that 21 million cap is never going to get more. And you've got global adoption. You've got massive adoption in the African countries whose currencies are so volatile that Bitcoin is in fact even less volatile than their currency is. It's still a better store of value. Same with Venezuela, Argentina, places over in South America. So they get this proposition much more quickly than we do in the West, because the US dollar, for all its faults, and the Aussie dollar for all the printing, and the euro and so forth, US dollar is still the strongest horse in the glue factory. But it is trending to zero, because as soon as they print to infinity, as we go to infinity, purchasing power goes to zero. That is guaranteed. Therefore, that's where people start to cotton on. And as soon as you've got not only global adoption in the global south, but if you imagine all the high net worth individuals in the world putting 1% of their, just as a hedge, which we've seen people like Stanley Druckenmiller do, just as a hedge against the rest of all the other asset classes, which are all in US dollars, if they start putting it in there. You've got energy companies taking Bitcoin onto their balance sheets because they're using miners to offset demand response of their energy. So miners will go in and sit alongside for cheap energy supply at an energy company, and they can turn on and off their usage of the energy for peak times and trough times in demand elsewhere in the economy. So they're getting involved in Bitcoin. You've got BlackRock, who have had a 99.9% hit rate in terms of when they submit for an ETF. to create an exchange traded fund, they always win. I think there's been one rejection, and they've just submitted for a spot Bitcoin ETF, which means it would be matched 1-for-1 Bitcoin to the shares, if you like, that you're buying within that ETF or units. So the adoption is crazy, and it's going to get, as we get institutional adoption coming in, it's going to get bigger. And this thing is not going away. And each cycle, so there's this 4-year cycle with Bitcoin, and each cycle, yes, you're right, you get a surge in the peak market, in the bull market, and it goes crazy, and everyone gets FOMO, and it brings in all these new players, and it goes nuts. And then there's a topping off period, what's known as a distribution period in technical analysis. And then, the big boys, the smart money smells blood, and they turn into sellers. And then there's this kind of equilibrium point for a little while until there's a breakdown. And then, but you've still got people high on the emotion of greed and lust and so forth. And so that happens. And so we get these peaks of troughs, and they are these. But if you look at a logarithmic chart, it's trended up and to the right over time, despite those peaks and troughs. And so you've just got to take the long view, really.
Yeah, I suppose the crux of it is it would be fantastic if the cost of Bitcoin compared to the value of Bitcoin compared to the US dollar or the Australian dollar was reflective of its usefulness and how much people actually wanted to buy it as a means of exchange, rather than being subject to these drops and peaks. But I mean, as a means of exchange, absolutely, I think it would certainly be viable and something that people would gravitate towards. We don't have a lot of time left, and there's lots I still want to ask you. So let's go to the utopian view of the direction that Bitcoin's going. And so let's say
Right.
Bitcoin increases in popularity as a means of exchange, and people start to use and adopt Bitcoin to do everything in their lives, rather than using the government's currency, which I think is the libertarian end that we'd all love to have Bitcoin serve that purpose. And potentially, this is where the idea of parallel societies comes in, where, half the people still use the government's currency and live in that world, and the rest of the world just uses Bitcoin and exists outside of the purview of government. A question which would be, that's the ideal libertarian end, and kind of the way that we might be able to achieve freedom in such a statist society. But so this is, I suppose I'm asking for an opinion here. Let's say that this utopia does come about, and that there is a widespread adoption of Bitcoin. The world that we live in as libertarians, we realize, is extremely statist, and the state is holding on to that power with the most clenched tendrils of necessity. Don't you think if Bitcoin became this freeing means of exchange, that the government wouldn't clamp down in an enormously authoritarian fashion, banning Bitcoin, trying to use force to stop people using Bitcoin, regulations around where you can even live if you don't subscribe to the government's currency, and almost even requisitioning Bitcoin, as they did with gold in, I think it was 1934. There was the big requisition of gold because of these fears that gold would go up enormously in value because their currency was screwed. If Bitcoin achieves this level of notoriety, do you think the government's clamp down would be able to suppress it? That's kind of a doubt that I have in my mind.
Good question, and it's a question that comes up for all of us somewhere along the line. And I would say, yes, they absolutely will fight back tooth and nail. It could get, in fact, really ugly. I don't know how bad that could get. And there's the possibility that they can't be as ruthless with a CBDC as they might be otherwise if there is an alternative out there. So that's one way of looking at Bitcoin. They can't stop Bitcoin because it's a protocol like the internet. They can't stop the mining, they can't stop the producing, etc. There's a number of things that could go on here. One is that we could end up with jurisdiction competition, which is you're not going to have all governments in the world clamp down at the same time. And there's such anti-US sentiment in much of the world that many, simply to spite them, and this is where game theory comes in, will allow Bitcoin just because. And then because those economies start to thrive, which is what we've seen in El Salvador, where they've adopted Bitcoin as legal tender, then they become more and more attractive jurisdictions. So that's called flag theory. And that makes a great deal of sense. Could the government shut down? Well, they can't shut down the blockchain. They can't shut down Bitcoin. What they can do is make it very difficult. So you've given a number of examples there that are excellent. They can shut down the on and off ramps and make it very difficult to buy and sell. And that could make it go underground for a period of time. But there will always be, and there already is, ways that you can buy. So it will just send it into black market for a period of time until it becomes impossible to suppress any longer, and you get mass exodus of people who want freedom, and then other people who want to stay behind and live on the CBDC and get their UBI and, watch their economy and their nation go to hell in a handbasket, albeit over a number of decades. And I'm just reading Atlas Shrugged at the moment, and she outlines that beautifully, the decay. That's exactly where I'm up to in the book. So there's that. In terms of being able to requisition it like gold, it's physically not possible. I mean, they literally have to. So first of all, the way they got gold back in with Section 6102 and whatever it was in 1934 or whenever it was, most of it was held in storage somewhere. They did, but I don't think they went door to door and literally raided your house. That's not my I need to find out more about that. Now, Bitcoin all the harder, because if you're self-storing your Bitcoin, which I highly recommend, everybody does. If there's a second thing to take away from this, I mean, take out whatever you want to take out from this conversation, but one is Bitcoin is different from the rest of cryptocurrency. And number two is there's a phrase in Bitcoin, not your keys, not your coins. If you haven't got what's called the private keys, which is a way of self-storaging your own Bitcoin in your own home on a hard wallet, on a cold storage device, then really it's up for grabs by government or by anyone, or by some scammer who you might have bought, or some exchange that ends up being dodgy, like FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried recently. And we've seen that play out in a number of different ways. So if I've got my own private keys at home, what that means is I've got a 24-word passphrase in my brain. And they've got to get it out of my brain, which means they have to physically come into my home and torture me to get, and I've got to be able to remember under torture circumstances, 24 words in order for them to get it out of my brain. And if I'm being tortured, I'm not going to remember those. And then the Bitcoin's just lost. They can't get it. I can't get it. It's gone.
And if we're at that point, we're at 1984 levels of authority anyway, and we've got 100 more pressing problems than that anyway, if we're at that point of authoritarianism.
The point. Spot on. So they can send it underground for a period of time, absolutely. But there's no way of actually stopping it. And it will find ways to get out through the edges, even in Australia, even if you don't move country. And it can't not win in the long run because it's too convenient. It's too easy for international trade. It's a trusted third currency and there's no controlling it. And it's a powerful technology that gives power back to people.
So let's just before we finish the other thing. So central bank digital currencies is something that we've started to hear a lot more about in the last couple of years. And so just broad strokes briefly, what are they, or why should we be worried? Because they and again, I'm nowhere near an expert on this. Do they operate similar to Bitcoin? Are they trying to mimic Bitcoin? Are they trying to compete with Bitcoin? What is the deal here?
All they are is exactly what we've got now. It's fiat in digital form. I think they're using, I've heard something that they're using proof of stake, which is a different type of technology that's used by people like Ethereum. You might have heard the name Ethereum, which is the second biggest cryptocurrency. They use proof of stake rather than proof of work, which is it's a much more complicated technology actually. But it means they can control it. It's centralized. So like Ethereum, there's a managing director, CEO, Vitalik Buterin. There's a business. They can, I mean, there's pros and cons of Ethereum as a business structure, but it's by no means anything like Bitcoin with its proof of work technology and its decentralized nature. So my understanding of CBDCs is it's just much like it is now, minus the cash economy. So the government control it, the government print it, they make as many units as they like, they do what they like with it, it circulates amongst the rich first and serves to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And they've even been talking about things like in America, you've got someone who's like the Biden appointed someone who was like comptroller of currency. And she suggested two things. Everyone has to have an account with the Federal Reserve. So now we can watch everybody's transactions, exactly what you spend, where you spend it. And that there was a second thing that she brought into play. Oh, that she said it's got to be linked to social credit. And this is the danger. So she's already said that openly, whereby compliance is rewarded and non-compliance, you have your labor, your time, your money, everything that you put in to make your money simply taken away from you like that, because you have spent on something or you have said something on social media that we don't like, you lose your money, hey presto. So the level of control with a CBDC, you could argue it's there to some degree now, but it only becomes uglier with a CBDC.
And I suppose that's an important point that you've made, and maybe this is a way that someone who is completely unfamiliar with Bitcoin might start to sort of understand the power of Bitcoin. Is the important distinction between a central bank digital currency and what we currently have is the possibility to use cash for things, because cash has that same benefit whereby, hey, if I just want to give some money to someone for providing me a service and I don't want anyone to, it's no one's business whether that we traded money or what they gave me or what it was, and I don't want to pay any of the millions of taxes that the government seems to claim are their right over just regular transactions. Cash is a way to avoid this. So even just that the restriction of cash and the restriction of use of cash, which we're seeing everywhere, I suppose, is a head towards that totalitarian direction, which I suppose libertarians should be very frightened of and very wary of.
100%. I was chatting with a cousin of mine the other day who's living currently in regional WA. She's traveling around the world. She's traveling around Australia at the moment. But she's found over there's two users of cash. There's the older crew who never really got used to the new technology, but she said the younger crew are doing it as a political expression of their, I guess, their dissatisfaction with governments and their invasion of our privacy and our lives. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. It's like when I see young folk in libertarianism and you go, ooh, a little bit of hope for the world. A few people thinking for themselves out there and not entirely, and not going with the mainstream narrative. And that's, it doesn't take many. It takes a small group of committed people to keep itching and to keep scratching. And we saw it. I was part of the Green movement in the early days. I used to hand out how to vote flyers 35 years ago for the Greens. And that's because it was a small movement, but they kept itching and they kept, at it. And now it's big green. It's like big pharma. It's like big tech. It's like anything. It's a movement in its own right, which means it's time to move on to other things. But that's all we need to be as libertarians and Bitcoiners, is a small group absolutely committed to freedom. And we'll get there. We'll keep agitating.
I couldn't
They're
have
not
said it
getting
better
rid of me in a
myself.
hurry.
That's no, that is abundantly clear. I think that's a perfect way to end it. I think that's a great last message to end on. Is perfect. Is that it's we're all libertarians and Bitcoiners are fighting kind of the same fight, and that's one that if you're aware of this fight, is absolutely paramount for all of our survival. We'll leave it there for this episode. Thank you so much, Carri, for coming on. I'll put links to anywhere that people can find you in the description to this episode. For us, you can find us on Instagram, Spotify, YouTube, and Twitter or X. So thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you've taken something away from this, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you so much for having me here, Pietro. Pleasure.
Pleasure.